Imagine buying your dream home. No HOA, no ridiculous rules. Pure freedom. But then out of nowhere a self-proclaimed HOA queen shows up, demanding you obey rules that don't even exist. And when you refuse, he calls the cops on you. Sounds insane, right? Well, buckle up because this petty tyrant made one big mistake. She messed with the wrong homeowner. By the time I was done with her, she lost everything. This is the story of how I exposed the biggest HOA fraud in history and got the sweetest revenge. Trust me, you don't want to miss this. Hello, beautiful people. Before we dive in, a small click from you can help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Hit that subscribe button and be part of the journey. Let's go. Jake had finally done it. After years of saving, searching, and dealing with shady realtors, he had found his perfect home. A cozy, well-kept house in a peaceful neighborhood with no HOA. That last part was important. He had heard the horror stories. Overzealous HOA presidents slapping homeowners with fines for having the wrong shade of curtains, neighbors reporting each other over minor infractions, entire communities living under the iron fist of a self-appointed dictator. No thank you. Jake wanted none of that. The first few weeks were bliss. The neighbors seemed friendly but kept to themselves, and the lack of strict rules meant Jake could finally enjoy his home the way he wanted. No one told him what color to paint his mailbox. No one cared if he left his garbage bin out an hour too long, and no one sent him threatening letters over minor landscaping choices. It was perfect. That was until she arrived. Karen. The first time Jake met Karen, he thought she was just another neighbor dropping by for a friendly chat. She was a woman in her late 40s, dressed in what could only be described as aggressively beige attire, clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon. She had the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and when she spoke, it was with the over-practiced enthusiasm of someone who had rehearsed the conversation in her head a dozen times. "Hi there. You must be Jake," she chirped, eyes scanning him like she was assessing a new recruit. "I'm Karen. I run the neighborhood HOA." Jake blinked. This isn't an HOA neighborhood." Karen's smile twitched, but she quickly recovered. "Well, technically some houses aren't officially part of it. But most of the community has voluntarily joined because they understand how important it is to maintain property values and community standards." Jake already didn't like where this was going. "Right. Well, I'm good. Not interested." Karen let out a small laugh as if he had just told a joke. "Oh, you don't understand. It's not really optional. You live here, so you need to abide by the HOA guidelines. Here," she shoved a thick packet of documents into his hands. "Just sign these and we can get you all set up." Jake flipped through the pages, his eyebrows raising at the sheer number of rules and restrictions. There were fees, mandatory approvals for any exterior changes, and absurd regulations that micromanaged everything from how often you could mow your lawn to what color Christmas lights were acceptable. "Yeah, I'm not signing this," he said, handing the packet back to her. Karen's smile disappeared. "I don't think you understand how this works." "I think I do," Jake replied. "I bought a house that's not part of an HOA. That's why I bought it. So, thanks but no thanks." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll give you some time to reconsider," she said, her voice noticeably less cheerful. Jake thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. The next week, Karen started her campaign. It began with subtle things, side-eye glances when she walked past his house, exaggerated sighs when she saw his trash bins, shaking her head disapprovingly at his mailbox as if it personally offended her. Then came the letters. The first one was a friendly reminder that HOA fees were due. Jake crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash. The next one was a notice of community violations, listing infractions like excessive yard clutter. He had a single lawn chair on his porch. And unapproved landscaping, his flower bed, which had been there when he bought the house. Then Karen took it up a notch. Jake came home one evening to find a bright orange violation notice taped to his front door. In large, bold letters, it claimed he was being fined $500 for failing to register his house under the HOA. Below that, a stern warning: failure to pay will result in legal action. Jake laughed. He actually laughed out loud. This woman was serious. Deciding to handle it directly, he walked over to Karen's house. She answered almost immediately, as if she had been waiting for him. "Jake," she said sweetly, though the smugness in her tone was unmistakable. "I was wondering when you'd come around. Karen, I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but I don't owe you a dime." My house is not part of the HOA. Karen folded her arms. Everyone in this neighborhood benefits from the HOA's work, so it's only fair that everyone contributes. Not how that works, Jake said flatly. You can't just make up rules and expect people to follow them. Karen's smile didn't waver. You'll see soon enough. The next morning, Jake found a fresh letter in his mailbox. This one claimed he was being reported to collections for unpaid HOA fees. Another letter threatened legal action if he didn't remove his unapproved garden. Jake knew what Karen was doing. She was trying to bully him into submission. But she had underestimated one thing. Jake was stubborn. And he wasn't about to let some power-hungry suburban tyrant push him around. Later that evening, as he was grilling in his backyard, he heard the unmistakable sound of someone clearing their throat. He turned to find Karen standing at the edge of his lawn, arms crossed. I hope you're planning on putting that grill away after use, she said pointedly. It's an eyesore. Jake grinned. It's a grill, Karen. That's where it lives. Karen's eyes narrowed. You're leaving me no choice, she said dramatically, pulling out her phone. I'm calling the police. Jake blinked. You're calling the cops, over a grill? You're trespassing on HOA property, she snapped. Jake looked around at his own fenced-in backyard. Karen, this is my property. Karen ignored him, dialing. Yes, I need an officer to come immediately. My neighbor is violating HOA regulations and refusing to comply. Jake had never seen someone abuse the emergency line with such confidence. But he wasn't worried. He knew exactly how this would go down. 20 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up. A bored-looking officer stepped out as Karen marched up to him with the energy of someone about to win an argument. Officer, thank you for coming, she said, pointing at Jake. This man is refusing to follow community guidelines and is violating multiple HOA regulations. The officer turned to Jake. Sir, do you live here? Yep. Do you have proof of ownership? Jake nodded, already pulling up his property deed on his phone. The officer barely glanced at it before turning back to Karen. Ma'am, this property is not part of an HOA. Karen's face twisted. But the community... Ma'am, the officer sighed. You don't have authority over this property. If you keep harassing your neighbor, he has grounds to file a complaint against you. Karen's face went red. Harassing? I am simply trying to maintain standards. The officer shook his head. This is a civil matter. Don't call the police unless there's an actual emergency. Karen stood there, mouth opening and closing, before turning sharply on her heel and stomping away. Jake couldn't help but chuckle. Karen had just played her best card and it had completely backfired. But deep down he knew this wasn't over. And he was right. Karen was just getting started. Jake woke up the next morning expecting things to settle down after the whole police fiasco, but he should have known better. Karen wasn't the kind of person to back down when she didn't get her way. If anything, her failure to strong-arm him into the HOA only made her more determined. The first sign of trouble came when Jake stepped outside to grab his mail and found a bright yellow violation notice taped to his front door. He groaned, already knowing who was behind it. Sure enough, in bold, capital letters, the notice claimed he was being fined $1,000 for failure to maintain community standards. There was just one problem: there were no actual community standards. Jake ripped the paper off his door and scanned it. The violations listed were ridiculous. Unauthorized exterior paint color, his house had been this color since before he moved in, excessive yard clutter, his single-potted plant, and failure to submit landscaping plans for review, because apparently mowing his lawn was now an offense. Shaking his head, he crumpled the paper and tossed it in the trash. This wasn't even subtle anymore. Karen was just making things up. Over the next few days, the petty harassment escalated. Mysterious HOA notices appeared in his mailbox. Karen would stand at the edge of his driveway, arms crossed, watching him like she was waiting for him to slip up. She even started taking pictures of his house, jotting notes down on that ever-present clipboard. The final straw came when Jake walked outside one morning and found his truck missing. For a moment he thought it had been stolen, until he spotted a tow truck pulling out of the neighborhood. Sprinting down the street, he caught up just in time to see Karen standing beside it, looking unbelievably smug. "Morning, Jake," she said, her tone dripping with fake politeness. "Your vehicle was parked in violation of HOA guidelines, so we had it removed." Jake could barely believe what he was hearing. Karen, this is my driveway. My property. You can't just tow my truck. She smirked. Actually, I can. According to HOA regulations. Jake cut her off. I'm not in the HOA. Karen's expression faltered for half a second before she recovered. This neighborhood has rules, Jake. Just because you refuse to contribute doesn't mean you get to be a nuisance. Jake wasn't in the mood for a debate. He turned to the tow truck driver. Hey, do you have any paperwork for this tow? The driver, who had been silent up until now, hesitated. She told us it was an HOA violation. Jake pulled out his phone. Let me make this real simple. This is my property. I have proof. If you take my truck, that's theft. The driver clearly didn't want to be involved in whatever this was. With an annoyed sigh, he turned off the ignition and motioned for Jake to take his truck back. I'm gonna need payment for the wasted trip, he muttered, turning to Karen. Karen's face went pale. What? No, this is his fault. He should have followed the rules. The tow truck driver wasn't having it. I don't care. You called me out here under false pretenses, so you're paying the fee. Jake grinned as Karen sputtered and flailed, eventually storming off in a huff after forking over the cash. But he knew she wasn't done yet. 2 days later, the police were back at his door. This time it wasn't about an HOA complaint. Karen had filed a noise disturbance report, claiming Jake was aggressively blasting music at all hours. The officer, clearly unimpressed, asked if Jake had been playing loud music. Jake shook his head. Unless you count me watching TV at a reasonable volume, no. The officer sighed, rubbing his temples. Look, between you and me, I think I know what's going on here. This isn't the first time she's done this. That caught Jake's attention. Wait, she's done this before? Oh yeah, the officer said with a tired chuckle. She's called us on half the neighborhood at one point or another. Claimed a guy was running an illegal mechanic shop out of his garage because he liked working on his car. Reported an old couple for excessive yard decorations because she didn't like their gnome collection. Trust me, we've dealt with her nonsense before. Jake smirked. So what happens now? Well, the officer said, if she keeps making false reports, she could face charges for wasting police resources. But for now, just keep doing what you're doing. You haven't broken any laws. Jake thanked the officer and closed the door, feeling a newfound sense of confidence. Karen wasn't some unstoppable force, she was just a bully with too much free time. And bullies could be beaten. The next morning, Jake decided to get proactive. He started talking to the other neighbors, casually asking about their experiences with Karen. What he found out was even worse than he had expected. Karen had been running her own little fiefdom for years, using fear and intimidation to control the neighborhood. Most people had just gone along with it, assuming she actually had the authority she claimed. But as Jake started digging deeper, he realized something huge. Karen's HOA wasn't even real. Sure, there had been an HOA in the past, but it had dissolved years ago due to mismanagement. The real kicker? Karen never bothered to tell anyone. Instead, she kept up the illusion, collecting dues and issuing fake fines while pocketing the money for herself. Jake knew he had her now. He quietly reached out to a lawyer, explaining the situation. The lawyer nearly laughed when he heard the details. Oh, this is fraud, he said, plain and simple. And if she's been collecting money from homeowners under false pretenses, she could be in serious legal trouble. Jake grinned. Perfect. Let's take her down. Now all he had to do was sit back and let Karen dig her own grave. Because once the rest of the neighborhood found out what she had been doing, there wouldn't be a single person left on her side. And that was when the real fun would begin. Jake knew he had to play it smart. If Karen had been running a fake HOA for years, tricking people into paying dues and following made-up rules, she wasn't just a nuisance, she was a scam artist. And scammers always slipped up eventually. He just had to help speed up the process. First, he needed proof. He started talking to his neighbors, carefully gathering information. Some of them had been paying Karen's so-called HOA dues for years, thinking they were legally required. Others had been hit with endless fines and violation notices just like Jake. One couple even showed him a letter from Karen demanding $2,000 for emergency road maintenance fees, even though the city was responsible for road repairs, not any HOA. The more he dug, the worse it got. Karen had been operating her fake HOA like a dictator, using threats, intimidation, and sheer audacity to convince people she had actual authority. And somehow no one had ever questioned it. That was about to change. Jake took everything he had to his lawyer, who was practically giddy with excitement. "This is gold," the lawyer said, flipping through the fake fines and notices. "Not only is she committing fraud, but she's been extorting money under false pretenses. If she's been depositing these payments into her personal account, that's criminal." Jake grinned. "So what do we do?" The lawyer smirked. "We let her hang herself. And then we make sure everyone in the neighborhood sees it happen." It started small. Jake quietly spread the word among the neighbors, telling them what he had found out. Some were skeptical at first. After all, Karen had been running her scam for years. But once they saw the evidence, they were furious. Then came the meeting. Karen had called an urgent HOA meeting at the community center, most likely planning to announce new fees or restrictions. Jake and his lawyer decided it was the perfect time to expose her. The meeting started like any other Karen production. Her standing at the front of the room, talking down to everyone like a teacher scolding a room full of misbehaving children. "We've had some concerning behavior in the neighborhood lately," she said, giving Jake a pointed look. "Some people seem to think they can ignore community guidelines and refuse to contribute to the HOA. That will not be tolerated." Jake raised his hand casually. "Quick question, Karen. When exactly was the HOA officially registered?" Karen blinked. "What? The HOA?" Jake said, feigning confusion. "You keep talking about rules and fees. So when was the HOA legally registered?" Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's always been in place." The lawyer stepped forward, holding up a folder. "Actually, no, it hasn't. We checked public records. The original HOA was dissolved 10 years ago due to financial mismanagement." The room went silent. Karen's face turned red. That's a mistake," she stammered. The lawyer flipped through some documents. "No, it's not. And the bigger problem is that you've been collecting dues and issuing fines for an HOA that legally doesn't exist. That's fraud." Someone gasped. Others started murmuring, eyes darting toward Karen. Jake leaned back in his chair, watching the panic set in. "So Karen," he said with a smirk, "where's all the money you've been collecting?" Karen's hands trembled as she fumbled with her clipboard. I don't have to explain myself to you people," she snapped. "This is ridiculous. The HOA is real. We have rules to follow." An older man in the back of the room raised his hand. "So where's my money, Karen?" Another woman stood up. "Yeah, I've been paying you every month for 6 years. What exactly have you done with that money?" Karen's face paled. It was for community projects." Jake's lawyer smirked. "Interesting. Because we looked into that too. Turns out there haven't been any community expenses or maintenance projects in years. No HOA bank account. Just personal deposits into yours." The murmurs turned into shouts. "Are you serious? You stole from us? I want my money back." Karen's carefully crafted empire crumbled in an instant. She tried to regain control, slamming her clipboard onto the table. "This is an outrage. I've dedicated my life to this community. I've kept this place running. And this is the thanks I get." Jake shook his head. "Karen, you didn't keep anything running. You ran a scam. And now you're going to pay for it." The lawyer stepped forward. "Speaking of paying, legal action has already been filed against you. You'll be facing charges for fraud and misrepresentation, and the homeowners here will be seeking restitution for every penny you took from them." Karen's eyes darted around the room, desperate for someone to defend her. But there was no one left. Her power had never been real. It was built on fear and deception. And now, with the truth out, she had nothing. Jake stood up, stretching. "Well, I think that about wraps it up. Good luck, Karen. You're going to need it." Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She let out a strangled noise, grabbed her clipboard, and bolted out of the room like a rat fleeing a sinking ship. The second she was gone, the room erupted into cheers. People shook Jake's hand, thanking him for exposing her. It was over. The fake HOA was dead. But Karen's downfall wasn't complete just yet. There was still one final twist left. Jake had expected Karen to go down kicking and screaming, but he hadn't anticipated just how spectacular her downfall would be. With the HOA scam exposed, the entire neighborhood turned on her overnight. No one had a single ounce of sympathy. The legal proceedings moved quickly. The evidence was overwhelming: fake fines, fraudulent financial records, and years of scamming homeowners out of their hard-earned money. Karen had been pocketing thousands of dollars annually under the guise of community improvement projects, none of which had ever existed. When she was confronted with the charges, Karen tried to play the victim. "This is a misunderstanding," she wailed in court. "I was only trying to help my community." The judge was unimpressed. He went through the financial records one by one, pointing out every suspicious transaction. Payments labeled as HOA fees deposited directly into Karen's personal bank account, withdrawals that suspiciously lined up with spa trips and expensive shopping sprees, and one particularly damning purchase: a high-end vacation to Hawaii, labeled in the records as a community outreach retreat. The courtroom murmured in disgust. Jake's lawyer didn't even have to argue much. The evidence spoke for itself. The judge ruled in favor of the homeowners, ordering Karen to pay back every single cent she had taken plus damages. It was a devastating financial blow. But that wasn't the worst part. Karen had been so confident in her scam that she had never bothered to save any of the money. She had spent it all, assuming no one would ever question her authority. Now, with the lawsuit crushing her and her finances in ruin, she had no way to pay back what she owed. That's when the bank came knocking. Since Karen had been using HOA dues to cover her personal expenses, including part of her mortgage, she was now months behind on payments. With her accounts frozen and legal fees piling up, she had no way to catch up. Within weeks, her house was foreclosed. The same neighborhood she had tried to control with an iron fist watched as she was evicted from her own home. Jake stood on his porch the morning the movers came to take her things away. Karen, looking absolutely defeated, stood on the curb, arms crossed, eyes darting around as if looking for some last-minute way to regain control. But there was no power left for her to grasp. She saw Jake watching and stomped over. "Are you happy now?" she spat. "You ruined my life." Jake took a sip of his coffee and smirked. "Karen, you did that all by yourself." Her face contorted with rage, but she had no comeback. She opened her mouth, then shut it, turning on her heel and storming off. The final cherry on top? A new family moved into Karen's old house within a month. And to celebrate, the new homeowners threw a huge block party. The biggest the neighborhood had ever seen. Everyone was invited. Music played, grills were fired up, and people laughed and joked about how much happier the neighborhood felt now that the queen of the HOA was gone. Jake, standing with a drink in hand, watched as a moving truck drove past the entrance of the neighborhood, Karen's car following behind. She glanced back one last time, her face twisted with bitterness. Jake grinned and raised his glass in a mock toast. "Don't forget to pay your HOA fees in your new place, Karen." The truck turned the corner and she was gone. The neighborhood had won. And it had never looked better.